Welcome to the debate. So if I ask you right now, what did you accomplish at work last year? Whatever you are about to say is probably a fiction.
Or, at least a very unprovable exaggeration.
Exactly. And I mean, if you're listening to this right now and sweating a little bit because, well, literally every piece of career advice you've ever heard tells you to lead with your big accomplishments, you are not alone.
No, definitely not. But today we're actually dissecting why that standard advice might actually be destroying the truth of your professional history.
Right. We are diving into Module 4 of the Living Professional Record Academy curriculum. It's titled Capturing the Record. And specifically, we're going to tear into the methodology of what the curriculum calls Tool 1B.
Yeah, the evidence inventory and the foundational doctrine driving it, which is capture first, claim later, render last.
It really is a fascinating pivot point in the curriculum. Because, this is the exact moment where the advisor actually sits down to build a record from the raw, messy material of a client's history.
Right. And they're doing it with, frankly, one hand seemingly tied behind their back.
Yeah, they are. And so the central disagreement we are exploring today is how exactly we extract objective professional truth from that mess. The curriculum explicitly forbids asking a client, what did you accomplish during this initial capture phase?
Which feels very counterintuitive.
It does, but the argument is that the question itself produces, generic, inflated answers. Instead, the methodology demands very granular, mechanical questions. It wants to know, what did you fix? What did you coordinate? What did you maintain?
Yeah, the operational verbs.
Right. And I am going to argue today that strictly separating the evidence from the overarching claim and forcing these operational verbs is really the only way to bypass human ego and achieve, well, an objective professional truth.
And I will argue that completely walling off the concept of accomplishment during the initial capture is it's an artificial and potentially dangerous dichotomy. I think that by stripping the overarching narrative out of the evidence inventory, we risk losing the crucial context.
The context, right.
Yeah, and the professional judgment that actually gives the work its meaning. You might get the raw data, but you lose the soul of the work.
Okay, well, let me start by explaining why that wall is absolutely necessary. And it really comes down to the psychology of memory and, frankly, the modern professional ego.
Sure.
When someone walks into a room or opens a blank document, right, and you ask them about their accomplishments, they immediately switch into marketing mode. A client will sit down and say, I transformed the department, or I optimized synergy.
Oh, optimized synergy. Yeah, the corporate jargon.
Right. It's just an invitation for a generic, unprovable narrative. It is essentially premature resume writing, which the module explicitly warns against.
It does.
So by replacing that urge with targeted questions, like, what did you create? What did others rely on you for? Tool 1B grounds the capture in verifiable artifacts. This strict sequential separation, capture before polish, is just an essential firewall.
Look, I completely agree that AI-inflated drafts and that corporate jargon are a modern plague on professional truth. But I look at this mechanically. If you dismantle a clock to inventory its gears, you know exactly what parts you have, but you've lost the time.
I see what you're saying, but
Wait, let me finish this thought. The clock no longer serves its function, right? If we only ask a client, what did you fix or what did you coordinate, we are only extracting task-level data. And the text itself notes that clients remember outputs more easily than they remember their own judgment.
yes, they do.
So doesn't Tool 1B's highly mechanical line of questioning risk missing the overarching judgment entirely? I mean, you might find out a client coordinated a spreadsheet, but you miss the fact that this specific spreadsheet fundamentally changed how the entire company assessed risk.
Well, that is exactly where the distinction between a task and evidence matters. And I think it's important to clarify how Tool 1B actually functions in practice here. It's not just a mindless spreadsheet of documents.
But it is highly structured.
It is, but it's a structured conversation. The methodology refuses to accept judgment as a self-declared accomplishment, yes, but it actively hunts for the evidence of that judgment.
Right, the constraints and trade-offs.
Exactly. Tool 1B explicitly requires recording decisions, constraints, and trade-offs. It asks, what risk did you manage? What did you prioritize? What did you decline to do?
But you are still asking them to translate their lived experience into a fragmented format.
Let's ground this in a real-world example. Imagine an IT specialist who spent 3 grueling weeks fixing a botched server migration. If you ask them what they accomplished, their marketing brain takes over and they say, I optimized network uptime.
Right.
Which means nothing.
Absolutely nothing.
To a future employer, it's a claim without a foundation. But if you use the methodology and ask, what did you prevent? Their episodic memory triggers. They say, oh, I prevented a catastrophic data wipe because the legacy system was failing.
Okay, that is a much better answer.
Now we have evidence. We bypass the marketing brain and access the operational reality. We still have the time, to use your clock metaphor, but we are proving it by showing how the gears interact under tension.
I understand the mechanism. And look, the IT example is a really strong one for crisis management, but I want us to consider the cognitive burden this places on the professional in a broader sense.
The cognitive burden? How so?
Human beings naturally organize their history around their achievements. We think in terms of stories, right? Seasons, and impact. If a project manager knows they just stabilized a failing $2 million account, telling them no, stop, don't tell me what you accomplished, tell me what you maintained, it forces them to suppress their truth.
I wouldn't call it suppressing their truth.
It feels like an interrogation rather than a collaborative recovery. You're basically telling them their understanding of their own value is invalid until they prove it to you in your specific format.
It is a governed capture. And yes, it requires intense discipline. But that discipline is exactly what protects the client from themselves. Which brings us to a cornerstone of Module 4's doctrine, and honestly a specific focus of Tool 1B. Start small enough to finish.
Ah, yes, the scoping.
The curriculum warns that clients always want to start with their whole career. They want to summarize a decade of work in one sitting, and that almost always fails. It creates massive overwhelm.
Yeah, nobody wants to document 10 years in a weekend.
Exactly. The methodology says we have to bound the capture. Tool 1B helps the advisor capture evidence around one role, project, season, or body of work. We start with one bounded unit. The best first record is small enough to finish.
I appreciate the pragmatism of avoiding full career overwhelm. I really do. But I challenge the extreme ends of this scoping. The text suggests you can start with something as small as isolating a single checklist someone created or one piece of feedback.
Yes, you can.
But if you ask a client to look at a single brick, can they truly describe the house? I mean, can you isolate the evidence of a professional season without understanding the broader career context that surrounds it?
Well,
if you don't let them establish the narrative of the house first, staring at the brick feels entirely disconnected from their professional identity.
But we aren't asking them to describe the house from the brick. We are making sure the brick is actually made of clay and not papier-mâché.
Okay, fair point on verifying the materials.
Right? And let me step back and explain how the curriculum structures this, because it doesn't leave the client staring at the brick forever. The methodology doesn't stop at Tool 1B. Once you have that bounded inventory, once you know exactly what was created, fixed, or maintained, you move to the next phase.
Tool 1C, the evidence to claim summary.
Yes, it acts as a bridge, and then you systematically reconstruct the context of the work. You take that one checklist and you build out the situation. What was the before condition? What was the after condition? Who relied on this? You start small enough to finish the evidence capture, and then you build the blueprint to reconstruct the meaning.
I hear the structural logic, I really do, but I just don't buy that the transition is that seamless for the human being going through it.
Why not?
Because you are asking the client to suppress their understanding of the overarching accomplishment during the inventory, only to painstakingly reconstruct it later through this highly structured context recovery.
Right, to ensure it's accurate.
But the text explicitly states evidence without context can be flat. So why intentionally flatten it in the first place by banning the language of accomplishment? If a professional knows their overarching accomplishment resulted in a massive efficiency gain, why make them play dumb about their own impact?
Because the language of accomplishment is deeply corruptible, especially when we talk about impact and metrics. And I think if you're listening to this, you have probably felt that pressure.
Oh, the pressure to have perfect numbers for everything.
Yes, the modern professional is conditioned to believe that no evidence means no value, and that every claim needs a percentage attached to it. I increased efficiency by 40%. Where did that number come from? Usually thin air.
Yeah, it's a made-up metric.
Exactly. So the advisor introduces this brilliant concept of measure clues during capture to combat this. The advisor doesn't ask for the metric. They ask, how often did this happen? How many people were involved? Did the volume of repeated questions decrease after you clarified the process?
Look, I will acknowledge the safety in that approach. The pressure to invent metrics is a real systemic issue, and measure clues are a smart way to de-escalate that pressure.
They really are.
If someone says they improved a process, asking them how many steps were removed is a great clarifying question.
Exactly. The module explicitly states, a clue is not a metric until supported. If the client cannot verify a number, do not invent it. This keeps the focus on observable changes, the before, after, and difference, rather than fabricated data. It removes the anxiety of not having a dashboard to prove your worth.
It removes anxiety, sure, but it also highlights the very tension in the methodology we are debating today. You say they aren't playing dumb, but they are essentially being asked to withhold their overarching understanding of their success until the advisor grants them permission to claim it later.
I wouldn't frame it as granting permission.
But it kind of is. If an onboarding specialist knows they completely revolutionized how new hires experience their first 30 days, telling them, just give me a measure, clue about how many fewer emails you received, might secure a data point, but it frustrates the recovery of meaning.
I see why you think it frustrates the meaning, but I would argue it actually uncovers the true meaning. Improved or revolutionized are weak words because they are entirely subjective.
Subjective, sure, but they carry the weight of the effort.
Revolutionized how, though? Was it clearer? Was it faster? Was it safer? Was the process less dependent on one single person? The before, after, and difference framework demands actual meaning, not just a flashy label. And this honesty extends directly to how we define a person's role in the work.
Ah, you're talking about the contribution verbs.
Yes. The text mandates what it calls contribution truth. This means using the accurate verb, not the biggest, most impressive verb you can find in a thesaurus.
Right. Finding out if they owned it, led it, or just coordinated it.
Exactly. Or simply maintained or learned from it. Let me explain why this matters. When a candidate tells an employer they managed a massive corporate initiative, the employer instantly has their guard up. They're looking for the lie.
True. Everyone claims to be a manager in a resume.
But if the candidate says, I maintained the legacy database that the initiative relied on, it is so specific and humble that the employer immediately believes it. The friction of doubt just disappears. Tool 1B's mechanical structure builds incredible trust by preventing ego-driven inflation.
That assumes inflation is the only risk, though. But the text also warns against erasure. And this is where my concern about atomizing the work into maintained or coordinated buckets really crystallizes.
Erasure? How does being specific cause erasure?
Think about the reality of the workplace. We know that invisible labor, especially for women and minorities, is often downplayed. A client who says, I just helped out, might actually have evidence of complex coordination, issue tracking, stakeholder alignment, and informal leadership.
Well, yes, but
Doesn't a strict anti-claim, anti-accomplishment process inherently bias the capture toward underclaiming? By banning the big narrative, you are placing a massive burden on the advisor later to magically extract the true value from a pile of humble, atomized tasks.
it absolutely places the burden on the advisor. But that is exactly where the burden belongs. It belongs on the rigorous process of the living professional record, rather than on the client's ability to ruthlessly market themselves.
But if the data is just tasks,
When that junior developer says, I just kept people updated on the project, the advisor doesn't accept that at face value either. They use the capture flow to uncover the operational texture. The advisor asks, what decision did you make
What would have happened if no one handled those updates?
Right, using the constraints.
Exactly. Through those mechanical questions, they recover the informal leadership and the decision support without ever needing the client to brag or invent a narrative.
That relies heavily on the advisor's ability to spot the invisible labor hidden in a list of artifacts. But let's look at the reality of imperfect evidence. The module openly acknowledges that clients will have, memory-based entries, partial artifacts, lost files, or highly confidential work.
Which Tool 1B accounts for. It literally asks, what should not be shared?
Yes, it does. But in these murky areas, the overarching narrative, the accomplishment, is sometimes the only connective tissue that makes sense of the fragments. If a project was highly classified, you can't inventory the artifact safely. You can't list the code base or the client names. The story is kind of all you have.
Which is exactly why privacy must begin at capture, not at the end of the process. The doctrine is incredibly strict here. Proof is not permission.
I know, and I agree with that principle.
Right, so if you start a session by asking, what did you accomplish, a client might blurt out sensitive client data, proprietary strategies, or unreleased financials just to justify their grand claim. They want to prove they are valuable, so they spill the secrets.
Okay, that is a fair point. The instinct to prove an accomplishment can definitely override privacy training.
Exactly. By starting with the evidence inventory, by asking, what did you maintain, and what evidence remains, the advisor can immediately establish privacy boundaries. They can ask, is this employer-owned? Can it be redacted? Should this be excluded entirely from AI processing tools? You capture the boundary before you ever map the claim. Unsafe claims travel fast if privacy isn't locked down at step 1.
We are completely aligned there. Privacy must begin at capture, and the traditional resume is a fundamentally flawed, often risky starting point for professional record building.
Absolutely.
But, even with confidential work where you only capture the metadata and the boundaries, the context brief still has to eventually summarize what happened and why it mattered.
Yes, in Tool 2C.
Right. So I maintain my stance on the core philosophy. While granular, evidence-based capture is vital for security and accuracy, artificially separating the accomplishment from the inventory is a methodological ideal that just doesn't fully account for human nature.
I disagree, but go on.
It strips the work of its inherent drive during the most critical phase of capture, and it leaves you with perfectly safe, perfectly verified, but ultimately lifeless data if the advisor fails to weave it back together.
But lifeless data is a symptom of poor context reconstruction in the later steps, not a failure of governed capture in step 1. The capture first, claim later, render last doctrine is a necessary firewall against our own worst instincts. By replacing the ego-driven "what did you accomplish" with the objective precision of "what did you fix, clarify, and maintain," Tool 1B builds an incorruptible foundation of professional truth. Verifiable measure clues instead of fabricated metrics, and it demands accurate contribution verbs. This entire mechanism protects the record from the inflation of modern resume culture, ensuring that when the rendering phase finally happens, it answers to an unshakable source of truth.
And yet, we both recognize that a pile of evidence without context is meaningless. We both agree that an unverified memory isn't proof. But we also have to acknowledge that a lack of physical evidence doesn't mean a lack of professional value.
Of course.
The tension remains. Professional truth requires both the mechanical gears of the work and the overarching time it keeps. The LPR methodology leans heavily on dismantling the gears first to ensure they are real, but we have to trust that the framework can put them back together in a way that honors the professional's actual lived experience without losing the soul of their contribution.
It is a rigorous, demanding process, and it asks us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about documenting a career. We will leave it to the listener to decide where they stand. Is professional truth best found by looking at the overarching accomplishment, or must we meticulously inventory the operational gears of the work before allowing a single claim to be made?
There is certainly much more to explore in the methodology of the living professional record and how it challenges our assumptions about value. Just remember, when you are cataloging all those individual gears, make sure you don't forget what the clock was built for in the first place.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.